Thank you everyone for coming to today's discussion, Trump's assault on global governance, reasons and consequences. This panel is organized by the Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism-Voices from the Middle East and North Africa program at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Nadine Abdelrezet, and I'm the Outreach Officer for the Pathways program. I'm going to start by introducing the panel members. I'll start from the left. So Professor Amr Adli is the associate professor at the Political Science Department and the principal investigator of the Pathways program. Professor Adli has taught political economy at AUC and Stanford University. Notably, Professor Adli is the author of Capitalism, the Social Origins of Failed Market Making in Egypt. His research looks at political economy, development studies, and economic sociology of the Middle East with a focus on Egypt. And Professor Ibrahim Awad is the professor of practice of global affairs and the director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, and also the co-principal investigator of the Pathways program. He's worked for numerous global organizations, including the League of Arab States, the United Nations, and the ILO, notably as the director of the ILO Sub-Regional Office for North Africa and the director of the ILO International Migration Program. To my right is Professor Jason Beckett, who is the associate professor at the Law Department here at AUC. Professor Beckett has taught courses in public international law, international human rights, legal perspectives on the question of Palestine, and jurisprudence. His current research focuses on poverty, feminism, cultural pluralism, and the self-justification of mainstream legal analysis. So this might not be extremely accurate, but close enough. Okay, so I'll start off with an introduction on today's topic, and then we'll move on to questions for the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for everyone to ask questions. Okay, so as the global hegemon, the United States was a central architect of the post-World War II global governance system, advocating for free trade and pushing for a neoliberal global order through institutions like the World Trade Organization and the IMF, leading global development aid efforts through US aid and maintaining control over UN agencies. Throughout the first 3 months of his second term, President Donald Trump has actively undermined, in fact, abandoned these institutions, actively reshaping global governance, implementing unilateral tariffs and embracing economic nationalism, revoking commitments as part of bilateral and multilateral agreements, dismantling US aid, and along with that, funding for aid agencies worldwide. It's also implemented sanctions on the international criminal courts and threatened to occupy Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. The discussion aims to reflect not just on Trump-era policies in isolation, but on what they reveal about the deeper structural transformations in global capitalism, the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and the contradictions of this emerging international order. So I'll start with the first question for Professor Ibrahim Awad. So Professor Awad, could you please tell us from your point of view, what is the significance of the measures that Trump has adopted so far, and how do you see the aims and purposes of these different measures?
Thank you very much, Nadine. Before trying to reply to your question, I'd like to make a comment on what you just said. You said reshaped. I don't think he has reshaped. He is disrupting global government. But global government has not been reshaped yet. We don't know what global governance will look like. Yeah. So I think this is important because otherwise you accept that he has the power to reshape global governance. And frankly, I have my doubts about whether he has this power. So I think it's important to be precise. Isolation. President Trump does not want isolation. This is a unilateral perspective. which can lead to isolation, which can lead to isolation of the United States. An important isolation. You do not want to isolate yourself when you insist on having a military base in the Sea, in the Indian Ocean. This is not possible isolation. So this is the contradiction that you mentioned. I think it's important to understand what President Trump has been the successful measures that he has inundated us with. I think it's important to look at this famous report of the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation published a 900-page volume, mandate for leadership, the conservative front. It is estimated that 75% of the executive orders have their origin in this. By the way, the person in charge of trade in the Heritage Foundation blueprint, section called Fair Trade, is now the person in charge of trade at White House. So it is that I think that one of the fundamental contradictions is that the blueprint wants to remove politics from governance of the United States and governance of it. Remove politics and leave the interactions, political, economic, and cultural interactions without any limitations or without any correction. But at the same time, they impose taxes, they impose tariffs. And tariffs is an intervention in the interactions, in the economic interaction. So you have inherent contradiction because to the conservatives, I think to a great extent, I think the conservatives are taking advantage also of President Trump. They are using it. The idea of the conservatives is that you do not interfere in interactions. You do not, for instance, interfere to correct the current outcomes of old injustices. And this is why they are dead against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is why you end up with a racist perspective. And you end up getting rid of the George Washington. So I think there is some consistency, but there are contradictions in it. What is interesting from our perspective is that there is much to be said, in fact, but what is interesting is that we have a project about post-neoliberalism. In fact, this is post-neoliberalism, but it's a different post-neoliberalism than the one that we may be looking for, because this is not the neoliberalism. Remind me when I have one more minute. Let's say that a very important idea also is that is rejection of the idea of equality, sovereign equality between states. In fact, in the perspective of President Trump, you have the United States on top. It's a hierarchy, a pyramidal shape. The United States, its allies problem at lower level, and then the rest of the world. And this is an empire does not have obligations towards those who are governed. But the empire also has privilege. And this is against, completely against the idea of the international, so-called, inverted commas, international community. Let me just add that you do not find a word in 900 pages about the world, about the international system, about international society, about the international community. It's all bilateral relations. Like the tariffs. Tariffs are per country and not because of course the abhorred principle is the most privileged clause, for instance. So it is a force is what governs the world, but I will come back to it later.
Thank you, Professor Alwad. Building on this, Professor Adli, with the Trump administration, JD Vance insisting that retaliatory tariffs are necessary to balance trade deficits, consistently referencing national debt, what do you see as the underlying logic, if there is one, of Trump's tariffs in light of decades of deindustrialization and US moving away from manufacturing to a service economy, embracing financialization and control over financial markets? And how have the contradictions of the neoliberal global order, which the US has overseen, enabled Trump's economic rationale?
So thanks, Nadine. Thanks everyone for making the time for what I hope would be an interesting discussion. Well, I think that the whole thing, of course, has been managed in an extremely chaotic way. They tried to tell us that this was meant to be chaotic. I'm not very convinced. I think it is genuinely chaotic, having to do with some significant like levels of incompetence in like conceiving as well as in implementing whichever plans that they have. I completely agree with the diagnosis that this is unilateralism. I think it has to do with the reconfiguration of the United States imperialist role in the world in a way that would require the undoing of certain arrangements, not only economically, but having to do with security as well, having to do with international like cooperation, the global governance more generally, but also having to do with like the reorganizing of the world as a hierarchy, as you were saying, which of course it was an implicit hierarchy. Now apparently it's being pushed to become an explicit hierarchy where certain political units are expected to pay tribute, for instance, to the United States. Like he was referring to this like explicitly, like that they should pay tribute to the United States, etc. I think that many of these dynamics, what's going on, have to like are traced back to the United States itself and how things have evolved or devolved in the past 40 years of like neoliberalization under or starting with the Reagan administration that pushed for the financialization of the economy, that contributed significantly to the construction of the global value of the global supply chains in the way that is being perceived nowadays as extremely problematic, either on the basis of the deficit that it has not actually created, but it has just like exacerbated trade deficit, especially that it created a very heavy element of import dependency, not only when it comes to consumption, when it comes to production as well, like the inputs that are needed. And this is what we refer to as globalization, which is pretty much a story that has unfolded between the United States and East Asia. It's not really that much of a global thing. It's pretty much about these two regions of the world, North America and East Asia and Southeast Asia to a lesser extent. So I think that these are all signs of economic distress that was represented or pushed by a significant base of the United States population that again corresponds pretty much to the historical evolution like cross-cutting cleavages in the United States going back to the 19th century that ended up more or less like with us talking about the white working class. So there is a racial element, a racist element, a racial element, but then there is a class element as well, having to do with the constituencies that were significantly harmed by the reconfiguration of production along these global value chains, and that eventually led to the kind of extremely high volatility in the overall economic system, given the degree to which it has been financialized as an element of compensation in order to sustain very high levels of consumption in the meantime. So apparently, there is a recognition to the left as well as to the right, that this model has reached its limits to a great extent. I think that the overall federal system in the United States, and I'm no expert on American politics, but as a political economist who has been very closely following the debate to the right as well as to the left, that has been inherently critical of how things have developed in the past 40 years along the neoliberal lines. They do agree that there is a deep problem having to do with the United States apparently losing in its own game with other parties, especially, of course, China being also a geopolitical rival game. But also economically, you have the same problem with Japan. You have the same problem with, even with unusual suspects like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand that Trump is fighting with nowadays. So the overall issue, I think, and this is to conclude in the half minute, I think that there is a real class distributional conflict within the United States that has reached crippling levels to the political system as a whole. And what the right, that is very much post-neoliberal, is proposing is that we are going to solve this at the world's expense. What the anti-neoliberal left, that is the left of the Democratic Party, is proposing is that we are going to solve this at the expense of the 1%. So what Trump is saying is that we will have the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mexicans, or whatever pay for it. That's in a very cartoonish way. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very elaborate explanation of the evolved nature of the US political scene at this point. I'll move on to Professor Beckett. We'll pivot a bit. So we've seen with the Gaza genocide and utter disregard for the International Court of Justice and the ICC, with states explicitly stating that they will not enforce ICC warrants against Israeli war criminals. What do you see are the broader implications of the world's hegemony sanctioning the ICC and withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council for the legitimacy and the future of the international legal order, or whatever is left of this point?
Thank you, everybody. I want to start by stating the obvious, that while I would never dignify him with a name, the Planta-fascist that's currently in charge of the US was an inevitable symptom of the decline of the Democratic Party. So whether it was this particular orange man or another oligarchic fascist that took control didn't matter. It was going down. Second, maybe less obvious point. Regardless of when and where it died, the corpse of international law is now buried in the ruins of Gaza, and it will never be exhumed and brought back to life. The thing is that might not be a bad thing. So Nadine has asked me, as she always does, a deceptively complex question. What do we make of the legitimacy of international law? And I want to break that question into two parts. The question of legitimacy and the question of international law. Now, legitimacy is not an objective standard. It's not a thing in the world. It's a hegemonic construction. It's a device of power. So the real question isn't, is international law legitimate? The real question is, what does international law exist to legitimize? And the very simple answer to that question is colonialism. International law was specifically developed to regulate and justify the process of European colonialism from 1435 onwards. There is a mythology in international law that something changed in 1945, that the United Nations spoke to a new world and a new world order. And that is an ideological lie. The United Nations was created by and for the colonial powers of the 1940s. The rising American Empire, the rising Soviet Empire, and the declining British and French empires. The UN was structured to justify and to govern a colonial world. And that racism of colonialism is baked into the structure of international law. So take 1948, think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And again, there's a wonderful story that this declaration was a response to the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And again, that story isn't true. What was actually meant to happen was that the League of Nations minorities regime would be expanded from Eastern Europe to the rest of the world. But the British, the French, and the American empires all objected to that idea. They couldn't allow a minority regime in a colonial structure because it would show the evil and apartheid and oppression of their own colonial adventures. And what they settled for instead was a deliberately meaningless document that treats all individuals as equal in a world of gross and growing inequality. The final thing I want to say, the ICJ. The ICJ is not a court. And I'm going to say the quiet bit out loud so everyone hears it. Public international law is not law. It never has been law. It never will be law. There is an international legal order. And given this event is scripted and I know the next question, I will leave and tell you what that international legal order is for the next question.
Stay tuned. Moving on to Professor Awad, and building on what where Professor Beckett has left off. So thinking of the global governance system and how it's been since 1945, and then looking at what is happening on the US's side at this point, with Trump justifying pulling out of a myriad of international organizations whose policies have been shaped by the US over the past decades, including the WHO, so pulling funding for vaccination programs and criticizing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which you've already touched upon, while also bullying other states, which is something you've also touched upon already. But how do you see, what are the implications of this retreat for the future of international cooperation and the global norms that have been built over the past decades?
Thank you, Dean. In fact, I'd like to comment on that. Yes, it's also not 100%. You know, systems of genetics exist. So the United Nations operates certain, or let's put it this way, it realizes and preserves the interests of the most powerful. And yet, it's also a means for the weakest to get together try to filter, to reduce the sheer power, the sheer force that could be applied in bilateral. So it's different. What is it that Trump and the conservatives have against multilateralism? It's precisely that, because they think that multilateralism reduces the sheer force of the United States. And if you lift limitations, the United States will be made great again. So I wish that we had simple replies. We don't have in our areas, we don't have simple replies. We don't, I'm not certain, in fact, I'm not certain. This is important, very important aspect. With regard to what you said, I agree. I agree in the sense that about distribution, conflicts of distribution. But the conflict of distribution could come from another source, another origin. Because if you find China, Japan, the European Union, where does the service of the Chinese, the Japanese, of the Indian go? The service goes to US bonds, which maintains the value of the dollar and therefore maintains the standards of living of the Americans. Short of that, you will have distributional conflict within the United States. So, and this is important because for President Trump, the one should do what he was the conservative zone in the United States. And this is why in the Heritage Foundation blueprint, there is no section for the world. The world is seen through the lens of the different departments and institutions of the United States. And what should be done in the US should be done in as well. So there is here a real perspective to be taken into account. Now, with regard to international cooperation, of course, because force. Why would you consider that force is the only means to you? Because you consider that conflict is the origin of relation between. It's only conflict, no cooperation. This continuum of cooperation and conflict is really towards conflict. And therefore, all the purposes of the United Nations, I know that, and I understand what Jason said. Of course, I agree with it. So, but not in that cooperation side. So, with regard to Gaza, for instance, of course, this is critical, but it's not because of the executive orders of Trump. This has another origin, and he's not alone. In fact, the country is not alone responsible for the collapse of the international order because of so no international cooperation. So if there is assistance to be given, I will give it directly to country X or to country Y. And in fact, not even assistance. I will probably add in humanitarian issues, but not economic, social, and cultural issues. Economic, social, cultural issues. We have the power. And this is why I am keeping others from getting to my markets. Observe the difference between the perspective of Trump and that of China. Mm-hmm. China makes the access to its market, its power, even its power, its tool, access to it, and he wants to signify that keeping people from accessing the market is so. Of course, China is present in the blueprint I'm talking to you about in every single page, 900 pages. China, either called China People's Republic of China, PRC, or the Chinese Communist Party. It's all. So I think that we should not be surprised that international cooperation is absent completely from, and it's not absent because the USAID, what does USAID create? It creates soft power, but it does not care for soft power. It's only force. There is consistency. Yeah, it's consistency. Of course, against the interests of his own country. Yeah. But yes, but there is consistency. Now, WHO, of course, is abhorred. Why? Because it conspired with China. But not only that, because it works on family planning. And we don't want family planning in the United States, and therefore we don't want it in the world either. You see how there is connection. The Human Rights Council, there are only civil and political rights, no economic, social, and cultural rights. So these, and not only that, in the international instruments of human rights, you have, in the modern ones, in this, you have a provision on adopting policies in order to enable people to practice human rights, not for Trump. It's only a passive obligation, not to allow violation. So you see, there is a consistency, but there are contradictions also, and this is why you can see about the chaotic approach to, the deluge of executive orders was done on purpose. It was done on purpose so as to keep you from being able to react. But yes, I finished. So I think that we have not only the contradictions that we are pointing out, we only have an evidence now about adopting tariffs on Monday and then suspending them on Thursday. So what spectacle is greatest.
Thank you, Professor. So since you've already mentioned China, and obviously this is a very big theme, I'll pivot a bit and go to the question on China, which I've already shared with all three of you. And speaking of bonds as well, I'll build on that. So considering the claim that we've now entered a multipolar era, and considering the aggressive tariffs on China, as well as China's response on increasing controls over rare earth minerals, this coupled with threats from the US to occupy Greenland and the Panama Canal to counter Chinese influence on trade routes, how do we see this rivalry shaping the coming era? But also building on this issue of bonds that you already mentioned, there were claims that China's been dumping US bonds over the past period and instead buying EU bonds. So how will these relations shift throughout the coming era? How do you see them shifting?
Well, to start with the bond issue, I don't think we have any evidence that the Chinese were the ones behind the unexpected shake, shake in the treasury in the treasury bond market in the United States. Actually, there is evidence that Japanese, but also investors that are based in the resident as well as non-resident investors, and this is quite remarkable, by the way, that they are already. You have the confidence in the US dollar as the national currency that has the greatest use in global financial markets being shaken that quickly, and it's like immediately, like going from the real economy to the equity market and then to the bond market in a way that might indicate, by the way, that the United States is in probably a significantly weaker position than they even perceive. And I think that this is already showing, as chaotic as it is, in the well, what seems to be an admitting that like unilateral action is not going to cut it when it comes to redefining the. So the very idea of not only suspending them, but even like Trump calling China to negotiate before, of course, hitting them with a 245% tariff increase to them. So with inflationary tariff, that is, by the way, making the United States like a laughing stock. I mean, like the 145. And then, of course, with phones, and then they discovered that 90% of whatever is going to the United States is coming from China, and then they exempted them unilaterally. I think that all of these are signs that, whether they admit it or not, like they are not as powerful as they thought they were a week ago. Really, which adds, by the way, to the overall picture of decline, which I don't think is necessarily inevitable, but it's decline. The idea that you have these guys that are in charge, that are apparently doing whatever, without any checks on them. Like they are doing whatever. They are extremely, I wouldn't say only amateurish, by the way. They are like that. Are you referring to Navarro? Yeah. Navarro, for instance, if you listen to him, as Elon Musk himself, citing Elon Musk, he's a moron. The guy is an idiot. He's a complete idiot. I mean, like you just like listen to him, and like it's amazing. Like anyway. So the very fact that these guys are in charge, it's not only that they were voted into office with Trump, not directly. I mean, but then the very fact that they are doing whatever, learning by doing at a very high cost, and nobody's like stopping them. Nobody's saying anything. That's it. I think that these are all signs of that kind of distress, dysfunctionality, or decomposition, whatever, like in how decision making has come to. In the case of the Chinese, I think that it's a bit. There is definitely a rivalry. This rivalry has escalated significantly. It's a rivalry that is being addressed now in a very intensive and aggressive manner in areas like that have to do with international trade. But it can easily spill over into areas of international investment. And I think that this is the most important thing. It's not trade. We live in a global economy that has become too financialized, meaning that we have these apparently very much inflated financial assets, and everybody is complicit in inflating them and in keeping them as they are. And until now, the Chinese sovereign funds and other state-controlled financial agencies, together with like the Japanese, the Gulf countries, by all of the exporters of capital that end up exporting dollars, like they believe, like they have kept their ground. They don't want to bring this down. I have no idea whether, I don't think that anybody would do this intentionally. What happened with the treasury bond market, I think, is very strange. It's extremely strange, and I think, was even thought to be premature. The idea that people would look for alternatives to the dollar. There aren't any alternatives to the dollar, so you can't really exit the dollar altogether. It's like unperceivable for so many. However, they went into like significantly smaller markets. So overall, I think that this rivalry is going on, and it will most probably, I'm thinking on the reshaping. I think it will play a major role in the unmaking of global governance, but not necessarily in the remaking of it, at least for now.
This was a question for all, so would you like to
Which question?
on China shaping global governance?
Not complaining from the institutions and the functioning of global, because China has benefited since 1971, increasing, and especially in this century, China has benefited. In fact, it is when China has benefited, and the benefits of China has been perceived as far to the influence of the United States, that the United States has threat. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, if you dared say a word against liberalization of trade, against the Uruguay round that was going on at the time, we consider someone not to do too. But then would it be liberalizing now in the international trade? So I think the question really is to which extent the United States would go in dismantling the system of global governance, and I think the main important consideration is to which extent Europe, United States, to which extent Europe could adopt an independence, autonomous position. I think this would be extremely difficult because of the contradictions within the European continent itself, within the European Union itself. But I'm not convinced that President Trump of the United States will have a day. I don't think that they can prevail alone. And I think that resisting a dismantling of this system of global, of course, this global is not something that we want to preserve as it is either, because we are also, in a way, victims of this. But to reformulate the system, I think it is possible, but this needs a broad alliance and ideas, not so ideas.
Thank you. There's something else.
This was not the question I was promised.
No, you're getting another one. Would you like your questions? You go for that. It's also a time.
So, first off, I want to pick up on something you bring into that right at the end, but I want to make it clear. The current system of global governance is an abomination. It's a crime against humanity. But, and I want to make this clear as well, every single person in this room is a beneficiary of that crime against humanity. And if you want to think about that in a really simple way, if you have a smartphone, it was produced using child slave labor. Your clothes were produced in sweatshops by slaves. Your computers, your trainers, everything that we touch is a direct product of contemporary slavery. So I am unbelievably torn with the anti-fascists at the international level, because I hate the system much more than I hate the system because I understand it, whereas he hates the system because he's fucking stupid. And I'm sorry about my language, but I mean this. You have to be idiotic to believe that the US is a loser in the global economic system. In 2015, I know this is a bit out of date, but I haven't seen more up-to-date figures. In 2015, the overdeveloped states in the world, so the ones we call the international community, sent a total of $2 trillion to the underdeveloped states in trade, in aid, and in investment. $2 trillion. But in the same year, 2015, the underdeveloped states sent the overdeveloped states $5.5 trillion in mainly debt repayment and the purchase of intellectual property. In other words, the poorer countries of the world subsidize the rich countries of the world by about $3.5 trillion a year. Apple has the biggest financial capital in the world at $4 trillion. That's an American company. America is not losing from global trade, but the American people are, because global trade is dominated by what we loosely call 1%, is neither the 0.0001%, but that money exists in America. The government's just unwilling to claim it through taxation or regulation. Second point, America has always been a colonial power. The United States was founded on colonial genocide and built using colonial slavery. In 1823, they announced something called the Monroe Doctrine, giving themselves exclusive access to violent intervention in Latin America. Most of their interventions were on behalf of a company called the United Fruit Company. They're now called Chiquita. And any time a Latin American government tried to tax or regulate Chiquita would literally telegraph the White House, who would send Marines to depose that government and replace it with an American United Fruits friendly government. And that is literally where the term banana republic comes from. It was a republic run by and for Chiquita, using the might of the U.S. Marine Force. The U.S. had its openly colonial phase, including the capture of Puerto Rico, the subjugation of Philippines, the extermination or genocide of the Filipino population. This version of America is not an aberration. It's an honesty. It's an America with the mask off and the lies down. And in some ways, I think we should be grateful for that. I'm not going to try and fight mansplain China because I have no idea what their ambitions are.
Thank you for that. So we're off to the final question of the day to Professor Adli. And that is the contemporary form of governance post-2008 combined with it combined neoliberal policies when it came to social services and the welfare state on a national level with state capitalist investment in infrastructure nationally and globally, along with the revival of industrial policies in Trump's first term. In his second term, Trump has added protectionist trade policies to that mix. So how do we begin to unpack the contradictions of this newly emerging system?
So to start with, I think that the system that was established roughly after World War II, but especially since the beginning of the 1990s with the end of the Cold War in areas of economic governance having to do with primarily trade, investment, intellectual property rights, like regulating that on an international level. I think that this is being significantly disrupted because the main parties to exchange on any of these don't seem to agree on these basic rules. So if you have the United States pulling out implicitly or explicitly, the whole thing goes down. I mean, like think of the WTO, for instance. The whole idea here is that the very heavy concentration of international trade between the 4 or 5 actors, with the vast majority of the world population being somehow marginalized, as well as world the world political units, like what we call nation states, then the whole thing would collapse. So I think that there is an attempt at unilaterally redefining the rules according to which the United States is to engage with different parts of the world. I think that there are so many contradictions because they are definitely very open to the employment or the use of force or the use of their military might somehow in order as a leverage. Like, I mean, the whole idea of pulling out of their security commitments under the NATO for Europe, by the way. It is a use of their military might, but in a different way. But I think that there are some basic contradictions that this form of right or the strain of the American right, even though it does have some genetic resemblances with the right of the I would say that extending back to the what we call the neoliberals. They are very distinct and they are very much keen on distinguishing themselves from the neocons. Because again, that's another element of contradiction that has to do with the the class conflict in the United States is that the US imperialist role is actually nowadays the subject of some significant opposition from sizable constituencies to the right as well as to the left. And let's not forget, as a matter of fact, that the redefinition of the Republican Party to becoming a completely Trumpist party as we speak nowadays, to the detriment of the earlier reforms that were taken by Reagan, etc. And that's why, by the way, it's like it's very, very enjoyable to watch neoclassical economists, for instance, like being extremely perplexed by what the Republican Party is doing. So that departure from this has to do with the Bush legacy. It's like the Tea Party was not only against the rise of Obama to power, it was primarily against the involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and the inability to shoulder such cost. And I think that Trump, that even limits what is available. Because of course for Trump, like they can bomb countries or whatever, but then they cannot really afford to involve themselves. So all of these are limitations also about what they can offer. So the idea of cutting aid, the idea of showing the lack of commitment to long established security arrangements in East Asia, by the way, vis-a-vis the Koreans and the Japanese, as well as the Taiwanese, by the way, that are raising questions about like how committed is the US, as well as the Europeans. If this is happening, then you are losing the leverage that back in the 1980s, by the way, was crucial in getting countries like Japan and South Korea to, for instance, adopt voluntary trade restrictions. These agreements were reached, whereby the Japanese and the Koreans committed to limiting their own export surplus with the United States as a means for rehabilitating the U.S. economy, something that started in the 70s, but definitely continued under Reagan. And this is, by the way, the moment that inspired Trump with the use of tariffs or the use of. Why did the Japanese and the Koreans give in? It definitely had to do with the hegemonic position that the United States occupied back at that time. Nowadays, if the United States is simply not giving anyone anything and taking everything away, and that's it, I have no idea how they are going to unilaterally do it, even by force. By the way. And that's why, to a great extent, I think that this is a very dangerous moment, but it is hardly likely to result in the unilateral reshaping of global governance in a way that corresponds to the United States nowadays, by the way, extremely demanding approach to what the world should do in order to sustain whatever you have in the United States. It's as simple. It's not possible. I don't think it is. Especially that, look at the not only the deficit, the twin deficit, not twin actually, the too many deficits that we have, not only the trade deficit, but the budget deficit and the overall the overall size of the public as well as private debt. All these are vulnerabilities, by the way, that correspond to, as Jason was saying to a great extent, as well as Ibrahim, that the world has been paying, footing the bill to a great extent. Yet, I think that it is basically a political issue. You have some sizable constituent in this declining democracy. It still has some features of representative democracy, at least. And these are signs of basic distress. It's not delivering for the majority. It's not working. And the first attempt is at, again, going back to what I started with, trying to make the world pay for it. But then, do they have the ability to? I don't think so.
Speaking of departing from Reagan, I don't know if anyone's seen this, but on Twitter, the US Embassy in Washington posted clips from speeches that Reagan's made to make a point that Trump is going against everything and anything that the US has been enforcing over the past decades. Anyways, thank you so much for all the panelists. And if anyone has any questions, we have a few minutes left. Okay. I thought you kind of answered it, so let's okay then. So there is a final question, actually. And so after Trump's implemented tariffs on China, in his attempt to reshore industries and bring manufacturing jobs back to the US, tech experts revealed that an iPhone would cost about US $3,500, which is about 3 times the current price of an iPhone, which is $1,000 right now. So this is true, Professor Jason Beckett. What does that reveal about the discrepancies and extractive practices that plague the current state of global supply chains as they exist today?
Thank you. So I have a really long answer to this question that I'm going to try and give quickly. First of all, we have to see that this $2,500 discount on iPhones is basically just congealed human exploitation, suffering, and pain. The second thing I want to point out is that we currently live in the most colonial, most unequal world in history. At the end of formal colonialism in 1960, the GDP per capita of the richest country in the world was 30 times higher than the GDP per capita of the poorest country in the world. By 2000, it was 134 to 1. And by 2024, it was 479 to 1. We live in a world where the rich constantly get richer and the poor constantly get. As an aside to something that was said earlier about the World Trade Organization and the contemporary reality, it's worth remembering that it was Barack Obama who crippled the World Trade Organization. And ironically, he crippled it because he refused to appoint a Kenyan-American expert onto the appellate body, a professor called James Gatti. The WTO has been unable to use its dispute resolution system since 2015. Now, I said in my first question that international law wasn't law, and I stand by that. International law isn't determinate, it isn't enforced, it isn't complied with. But there's an exception that I call the global legal order. And the global legal order is the IMF, the World Bank, in certain ways the World Trade Organization, and the system of international investment arbitration. And those four institutions are unique in international law because they have the power to enforce their demands. They can literally punish, bankrupt, starve states who don't accept their demands. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the 1960s and 70s, which was the only phase in human history where the underdeveloped states actually began to develop. It was ended between 1973 and 1983. And the period between 1973 and 1983 is crucial for understanding the modern world. The states were developing using tariffs. Interestingly, no state in world history has ever developed without using tariffs and subsidies. The states were developing using tariffs and subsidies, but they were also borrowing money to do it because they had, as former colonies, very little control over their own wealth and natural resources as a result of international law. The debts were essentially sustainable until 1973. And in 1973, we had the OPEC oil embargo, which rocketed oil prices around the world and forced underdeveloped states into borrowing more. The same happened again in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. So the underdeveloped states became vastly more indebted than they were. And these debts were commercial debts at variable interest rates denominated in US dollars. In 1983, as part of Ronald Reagan's assault on the American working class, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, a guy called Paul Volcker, moved the base interest rate in 6 months from 4% to 24%. So these indebted states suddenly had to pay 6 times more interest on loans they already couldn't afford. And what they wanted to do, and what they should have done, was default on the loans. but they didn't. And no one has fully explained why they didn't. But it's almost certainly a result of US aggression and pressure. What they did instead was refinance their loans with the IMF and adopt, against their will, the neoliberal policies that destroyed their development and led to their contemporary poverty. So the point that I want you to see is that the global legal order, the system of legalized exploitation and suffering that we have at the moment, was violently imposed by the rich countries, especially the USA, onto the poor countries. And I'm going to say one last thing I want to close on. Amr said that the world is in a dangerous time. And in a way, I agree with that. But I want you to see that the world has always been dangerous. That just because we're not on the battlefield doesn't mean that the war doesn't exist. So here's one final figure for you. And it's a constant figure since 1974. Since 1974, global poverty, created by international law, has killed 50,000 human beings every single day. Global poverty kills 350,000 human beings a week, 1 million human beings every 3 weeks, and 18 million human beings every year. That's the dangerous place that the world is in, not Europe getting scared because America might give them tariffs.
Well, thank you for that very sobering intervention. I do miss the coming out of your class feeling quite depressed. Thank you for the reminder.
Wonder why.
So yeah, we can take a couple of questions. I know our time's up, but if you guys are, if anyone has any questions, now's the time.
Yeah, can I ask a question to two panelists or only one? It's your moderator.
Just one.
Huh? Just one? Okay. Fine. I wanted to ask Dr. Adli, so you described America's foreign policies as unilateral. I don't think anyone would disagree, but you also described it as idiotic. Now, is there in any way, like, I used to, I've read about the national system theory and the way in which China grew and how China, let's say, grew through its, liberalized, but also had a third way in which it also subsidized and enhanced industry. And then when an industry eventually grew, like the EV industry, they pulled out. Now, when they did this, when they tariffed and limited the access of Europeans to the market while simultaneously subsidizing their own, I mean, isn't the US kind of doing, like, I guess the same thing now? But you're saying when they're doing that, China's responding. So how come the West didn't do the same thing with China? How, like, because just basically I'm confused. Is the national systems theory something that Trump is pursuing now? And if so, is it self-serving? Maybe he's right. That's the question.
Okay, so a couple of things. To start with, we have to bear in mind that the path that China took, it was shaped by state intervention on many different government levels. At least this is what the literature on China tells us. However, it's a story of integrating China into the capitalist global division of labor. And the way investments from the United States, especially in areas like high tech, have flowed into China, translates into the very impressive performance of these companies that are tech intensive, capital intensive, etc., in a way that tells us a lot about the deindustrialization and the losing side within the United States itself. So in that sense, no, the United States is the biggest exporter and the biggest importer of capital. And that is extremely important for us to take. And this gets me to the other issue. In the case of China, as well as the historical cases Jason was saying, including the United States, by the way, in the 19th century, like the national systems theory is not that of Liszt. He picked it up from Alexander Hamilton, by the way. It's a US Like if you go through the writings of Alexander Hamilton, he was the one who was like saying that we have to industrialize using tariffs, etc. It's pretty much there. So the issue here is that these were cases of upgrading by capturing higher value. The problem now with the United States is exactly this, that protectionism is about downgrading, not upgrading when it comes to capturing value, especially given the structure of the economy that is heavily financialized, by the way, especially financialized. The idea that many of these companies that are non-financial, by the way, are themselves, like they derive at least 1/3 of their total profit from financial assets. Apple is one of them, Nvidia is one of them, etc. So that itself adds volatility and makes it extremely hard to break and make the system or break and remake the system. That's why the whole thing might crumble. That's the point here. So no, like the idea is that this would be the first time in history that you have protectionism being brought in order to downgrade rather than to upgrade, because the United States is not going to struggle in order to reestablish the steel industry. It's not about capturing the value. It's basically about the creation of jobs that, by the way, there is another issue with manufacturing, is that most of the human innovation in the past 150 years, like since the Industrial Revolution, has been focused on saving labor. And that itself, by the way, makes it an impossibility to recreate the 1950s in the United States with General Motors or General Electric or Ford or whatever, because this is not even the case in China, by the way, unless the United States, of course, has the plan to downgrade even further by specializing in labor-intensive industries, like textiles and ready-made garments, etc., which is not going to address the distribution issue. Basically, you have labor, like wages. The share of wages in the United States GDP has been on sheer decline in the past 40 years. Real wages have stagnated. Consumption has been sustained because the whole thing is about consuming anything. Go gamok. The issue is that you cannot really sustain that level of consumption, or you could not, without very high levels of indebtedness, especially that what went, like the whole thing here went also with major tax holidays in order to allow such redistribution that goes upwards, creating these ridiculously huge private wealth that is, by the way, is even nowadays assuming individual wealth of interesting creatures like Elon Musk, for instance. I mean, like one single individual who is himself an embodiment of transnational capital. He's like South African, Canadian, the US. He's like he's like with a sledgehammer destroying the federal government, and then he will appear later on in another reincarnation. Like that's the issue. So it is pretty much about how the world got reorganized. But then, like the issue of protectionism, again, I think it does address, and this is the tragedy of it. And in this sense, by the way, Bernie Sanders is completely right, that the white working class should be voting for the Democrats, not for the Republicans. And he wishes to bring them back to the Republican, to the Democratic vote. But it's mainly about the redistribution of income and wealth within the United States. And then the externalizing of the cost on the rest of the world, that the Chinese will pay for it or whatever.
Did you have another question?
Hi, I want to ask a question regarding the Chinese and if there is an opportunity because China is more centralized, government is centralized, okay. So they have the resources and the capacity to plan ahead, long term, while in the US we have the Chinese administration more regularly. So the Chinese could move on undisrupted by, I would say, the shadow of democracy sometimes, and the chaos that could come from democracy, because we see in the US institutions that have been in the making for so many years are now crumbling, and it's not only the diplomatic institutions, but also communities of intelligence and military supremacy, and that's hurting basically the backdoor channels that the US is going to work, because in many cases, the world right now has a chance to rebuild against the US. This is like the Caesar moment in the Senate, the Ides of March moment. So there is a reason why the world is not taking the opportunity right now. For example, the GCC countries, they are the ruling dynasties are kind of tied into the literal dollar arrangement in the US. So in their best interest for the US to continue on. With Europe, there's always the fear of Russia. So it's in the best interest of the Europeans to continue working with the Americans. So what would be the moment when the Europeans would say, it's actually better for us to work with the Russians? Or the developing countries would say, it's the opportune moment to work more with the Chinese, especially the fact that Trump took away USAID. And USAID itself was problematic because more than 70% of the USAID economy is actually invested in the US. I would say if you look at the grain regions in the US, a lot of the infrastructure for grain silos is actually paid for in a way by USAID in order to facilitate the export of grains as their wheat export programs and wheat and corn and stuff like that. So the US basically is being undermined from within. And I would say that the world is kind of slow to take the opportunity to get free from that war. So how do you see that? Why is many powers to be are slow to react to this and use it as an opportunity and less as a threat? Thank you.
Let's take another question and then. Because I was thinking about also a lot the dismantling of USAID, and which is seen as a tragedy of colossal proportions to the global south. That's what a lot of the critics of Trump, I think, tend to overlook, is that organizations like USAID are at the core imperialistic organizations, and so was Trump's decision to dismantle USAID and other mechanisms and organizations, and could this possibly have been stupidity on his end of accidentally bringing the US empire in free fall, because he took a lot of these imperialist organizations or mechanisms that he took their euphemistic names kind of for granted? Or am I maybe quick to I guess, call it a solution?
I wanted to ask if, like, the unilateral policy on behalf of the United States, is it showing perhaps its allies that it's not as much of a zero-sum game between like a very distinct Western and Eastern bloc, but rather like a zero-sum game in which they themselves could one day wake up and see that they cannot depend on the United States as an element of their part of the zero-sum game. Because this is not just about from today, maybe the next administration will adhere to that east-west zero-sum, but you will sleep every day and wake up, and the next day, maybe the new administration does not. That shaking of the belief, is that the beginning of the avalanche? That's
Who wants to start? Okay.
It's that shaking of the belief that there is always going to be that.
Oh, that's not what I wanted to comment on. I wanted to comment on the thing you said before that. What earth makes you think there's going to be a mixed regime in the United States? What on earth makes you think there's going to be a mixed regime in the United States? Seriously, the Democrats have one chance, which is next year. After next year, no free and fair elections left. Who's they put in charge of the one chance? Fucking Chuck Schumer. Seriously, Chuck, Sure. This is long term. I mean, people have been saying this from the start, but we have to take it seriously. Think about it. Many of you are Egyptian, many of you are Arab, you've grown up in Arab countries. Think about the way that Donald Trump Jr. is paraded on stage before every event with the weird, fake English Queen wave thing. If that's not the favorite son of an Arab dictator, I have no idea what it is. So, I mean, as much as I would like to be optimistic, the only thing that's going to take the Phantom fascist out is a Big Mac. And B, he's just going to be replaced by something slightly less dumb, but just as evil.
What about dismantlement of say? Yes, of course it is. It preserves the system where the United States is throwing the produce of what other countries and populations do. Jason mentioned 1960s. In the 1960s, 1970s, there was this theory, dependency theory. And the dependency theory, in fact, what the prescription was ideally to delink from the system. To delink and get out of the system altogether. And this is a way to reconstitute a system, a more fairer and just system. This has not happened. Personally, I think that delinking is a great idea. However, it is not a practical idea, and it is difficult to put into practice. Now, I think that this leads up to that question of this question. I think that to rebuild at the time where it's like you build a building at the time you're living in it. And this is really a challenge. How you can build at a time you have to live in the system. And when will this happen? People, Trump has been in power for less than 3 months. People have not had yet the time to develop ideas. How can we rebuild this crumbling architecture? Because certainly this is finished. The order is finished now. How will we reconstitute it? And are we going to completely forget and ignore some of the purposes for which the world has come together? I personally think that some of the purposes of the United Nations are extremely valid. Extremely valid. But how to get to realize these purposes? How we get together again to realize these purposes? And then who exactly? Nation states alone. Dr. Hamza talks about this Musk, who is larger than many nation states, and more influential, by the way, than many nation states. So how will we reconstruct the world? Which world? Nation states. Nation states are also, by the way, nation states are recent creatures. Yeah. It's not written anywhere that they should survive forever. So I think that we need to wait until ideas develop, but I think it is possible. If it were not possible, we would not be here today. We only discuss what is possible in the future. We do not discuss something that there's no hope in the future. I think that it is possible, but of course you have to bring a coalition together. A coalition along states and along movements within states. People who think alike, movements who think alike. Can you completely ignore people in the United States of America who think like you and like me. You cannot do that. Can you ignore some movements in Europe? But Europe itself, countries are divided. I'm sure that many people in Egypt see validity in some of the ideas of Trump. And some people in India and in France and in Hungary. So I think it is difficult. It is difficult. It's not anything simple, but it will take time. And I believe, multilateralism is necessary. It is not a luxury. It is necessary. And this is why it will be reinvented. And nobody can tell you how it will be reinvented now, but it will. It will.
So just like picking the thread, I think that multilateralism is a necessity, especially that and here I differ a bit. I differ actually quite a lot from what Jason was saying when it comes to the what I see as a fact that the neoliberal globalization was so full of contradictions to the extent that it diluted the power of the United States to reshape the world the way it did after the end of World War II, when the United States constituted 40%, its estimate 40% of the world GDP, when they had enough capital surplus to rebuild Europe and Japan unilaterally, to capitalize the World Bank and to create the IMF, etc. I think that the bringing in of some constituent parts that consistently cheated, I agree with you, which is like China, you have to cheat in order to make your way up. They managed to, but this is the situation in which a significant constituent within the United States is a monolith. It is at the end of the day, and again, like the role that is played by imperialist powers has to be the result of a certain agreement, of a certain arrangement within the political centers themselves, and that's why the earliest critiques to imperialism, by the way, came from within the UK, like the 1902 Hobson's book about imperialism, and his argument, even though he was morally opposed to imperialism, but he was like saying that this is not paying off. This is not paying off, like sustaining the British Empire or whatever. And he was quite far-sighted, by the way, because he like if you go through the very nowadays rudimentary data that he tried to bring in, etc. He was like basically saying that this is not serving the majority of Brits, and hence like the mobilization of a constituency against the continuation of this. Even though, by the way, it's not only that we see Trump as maybe personally, of course, he's a genius at a certain level, he's extremely stupid on another. But the point is that, the classical imperialist order did commit suicide collectively. I mean, like leading to World War I and World War II. So, I mean, like there are so many contradictions. I don't think that one single force has ever been in charge. That maybe the United States and the one interesting thing here about the most of you maybe were not even born back then, but like in the wake of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, for instance, you have these neocons who had their ideologues, they have their theorists who were talking about the American century that lasted for less than 10 years. That's the whole thing. I mean it. Like the whole thing lasted for less than, like in 5 years, like the Americans were like packing out of Iraq. And as well as like the big miles in Afghanistan, the whole thing, like, and then you have the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, and the end of the whole thing. I mean, like the whole thing with the American century. So I think that in a sense, the system that was created or engendered by global capitalism is so full of contradictions, and this is why it's extremely it's extremely vibrant, but also extremely hard to predict. So that's it. Thank you.
So yeah, so we're way over time, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much for all the panelists. I think this was very insightful, and thank you guys for making it.
And let's